Patrick, there is no free dinner either. Thank you very much for coming on the show today. And I know you're no spring chicken. I've watched your videos. It's been a very long time since I watched your videos. I used to follow them avidly during the period of history that I refer to as the Wuhan Wars of the Covidistas. And I should say that I worked with the founder, Jeff Berwick, back in 2012. I wrote a small article back when he was working with Redmond Weisenberger, and it was posted, it was published in his newsletter, but they misspelled my name as Ortiz instead of Ortiz. I want to thank you very much for coming on the show today. I should explain a little bit about my background. I'm not allowed to work here in the Netherlands, where I've been living for the past 3 years, and that means that I have to find ways that are compatible so that I can generate some income. My wife took to painting in the past year. She's painted over 20 works in acrylic and oil, and this one is one of the most famous ones. I will put on the description below of the published video the presentation, the slides, where you can see my wife's works, and if anyone is interested, they can contact me to purchase. As I said, I've been here for 3 years, and my passport says Arbeit niet toegestaan, which means not allowed to work, while I appeal my application for residence on the basis of being spouse of a Dutch citizen, because when we got married, I sent them all of the relevant legal documents, birth certificates, marriage certificates, clean criminal sheet, etc. But they said, nope, you didn't begin the process from your embassy in your home country. And I said, yes, but it was closed because of the lockdowns, and they would not reply to our emails. Unfortunate as that may be, that is what it is, and I am waiting for a judge to come to a resolution sometime this year. So, Patrick, I want to ask you a little bit of your personal history with the advocacy and defense of liberty and freedom, personal, individual freedom, how you came to cherish, promote, communicate the ideas of liberty with people in your life.
Hi, I'm Patrick Smith. I host ANARCHAST and DISENTHRALL, and I'm also a technology entrepreneur, so thanks for inviting me for a discussion. How did I come to be interested in liberty, or how did I come, what's the question? Oh, interested in liberty. Sure. I don't think I've ever not been interested in liberty. I think I became slowly over time aware, and then all at once aware, that I didn't have it. As a conservative raised man in the U.S., we're told the government protects us, our heroes, and in blue, the police and the army and all the politicians serve to let us self-govern and be safe from all the evil out in the world. And that started to completely fall apart under even the slightest scrutiny. So that's, I guess that's how I came to that realization.
How old were you then when you realized this?
Oh, I was in my early 20s. I was flying on a plane reading Judge Napolitano's book, It's Dangerous to Be Right When the Government is Wrong, is the name of the book. It was a fantastic book. I was also reading Lysander Spooner's No Treason, The Constitution of No Authority at the time. And those two books together gave me my epiphany, 30,000 feet in the air when I was in my early 20s. I think I was flying on business or something when it happened.
I can relate to that. When I became a self-identified anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-libertarian, I was 21 years old. It was February of 2009. Can you tell me a little bit more about your conservative upbringing, early childhood, and the influence that you think that may have had by way of exposure to Dutch Napolitano or Ron Paul or any of these ideas that harken back to Jefferson and so on?
It was a pretty normal upbringing. I was parented sort of forcefully with a strong authority figure for a good portion of it. It was a typical conservative religious house. I went through public school like most here. So, when you come out of public school, that system generates liberals. And so I was sort of unquestioningly liberal Democrat at first, and then started talking to my parents, my mother, about it a little bit. She was very surprised at my positions, and I had never really thought about it. It's just the indoctrination you're given in state schools here. So just talking with her about a lot of the issues, and especially starting to get involved in business and starting my own business, woke me up to a lot of the problems with communism and socialism. And so then that's when I was calling myself, a conservative or at least a Republican.
Would you say your mother had influence in your adoption of the ideas of freedom?
No, she wasn't really part of that part of the journey. No, I kind of struck out on my own, and I'm the odd one in the family for sure. So
now, when you say that you had a religious upbringing, my default intuition is that you belong to some sort of Christian denomination, given the culture of the United States. I want to ask you about that, but what kind of religious upbringing were you given by your parents?
You mean like what denomination, or what do you mean?
No, I mean the elements of the teachings that they shared or communicated with you at home. What were the principal elements? It may touch on the denomination. It may touch on the practices of going to church, reading the Bible, etc. I'm curious about that.
Very basic sort of Pentecostal Christian teachings. The fruits of the Spirit, the virtues, the commandments, the major themed stories in the Bible, along with people dancing in the aisles and speaking in languages they didn't know how to speak. So that was definitely part of it.
I love languages that I don't know how to speak. I want to ask you about Rothbard. Okay. When did you first come in contact with the works of Murray Rothbard?
After I had become an anarcho-capitalist. He was not one of the like so many. He was not, and neither was Ron Paul, actually. One of my early anarchist, voluntarist, libertarian figures. I read his work later, but it was not in the beginning. I think it was like 2 years after, maybe.
And what was your first impression of the work of Rothbard? Were you already acquainted with the work, for example, of David Friedman and the Machinery of Liberty?
No, I did. Well, at that time, no. That was not one of my first reads either. I did read Bastiat's The Law. That was an eye-opening one for me, realizing sort of the shaky foundations of the traditional legal theory. But I read Rothbard and all of the good guys later on in my journey. Once I had sort of come to the moral justifications for when force was and was not appropriate to use, and I had tested those theories, then I started to move on to. That's when I started getting really involved in philosophy. Actually, it was getting really involved in philosophy of the founding fathers of the United States that led me towards questioning everything to begin with. And so, yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Now, I would like to say that this particular show belongs to the playlist and series of No Free Dinner Either, which is inspired largely by the podcast No Hay Almuerzo Gratis from Argentina. But one of the things that I would like to mention is that,
What is that from? Is that from There Ain't No Such Thing as a Free Lunch, Tonstoffel?
yes, exactly. That is literally there is no free lunch in Spanish,
Okay.
and they
Great
have
book.
yes, and they have interviewed friends who you've also had on your show, like Walter Block, and I have another playlist that is called Tankenberg News, where I go to the mountains and I record what I think are historically newsworthy events that you don't see every day, every year, or every decade. And the most recent video was shocking. I was a bit out of it, and it was not like every other video that I had recorded. And I want to address the news. My head was cut off on the video. I didn't realize it because I stood too close to the camera. And in the end, when I uploaded it and looked back on it, I decided I'm just going to leave that as it is. But I have to thank you for your presence today, because I would like to discuss with you and read to you a news that took place, that was published recently, about an event that took place a couple of years ago, and that is really shocking, but brings up a lot of questions. And the questions are relevant both to current institutions of what is enforceable, the legislation of the state, and also libertarian theory. So I'm going to read this to you, and I would like to hear your comments, because I am somewhat speechless, and it is not clear to me how to address it. So hopefully having another person comment on it may bring some light. I think that you are a year or two older than I am, so I think that also there may be wisdom in hearing your take on this. 10 years in prison for father 34 who raped his newborn baby in Omen. That's a town here in the Netherlands. A 34-year-old man from Omen has to go to jail for 10 years for the serious abuse and rape of his newborn daughter. The victim's mother, 33, has been sentenced to 1 month in prison. The court in Arnhem determined this on appeal. Diapers full of blood, 5 broken ribs, serious brain damage, large bruises, and serious injuries in and around the pubic areas. The newborn baby in Omen was severely abused and raped several times in 2022, shortly after birth in January 2022. The girl with brain damage and fractured ribs was hospitalized. So this person is apparently going to be 10 years in prison. And I studied law in my home country of Costa Rica. I've also studied some of the common law, comparative law, and I'd never heard of a case like this, not from US law, not from UK law, not from Costa Rica law, and also not from the extreme hypothetical lifeboat scenarios that libertarians like to talk about. So I ask you, what is your intellectual reaction to this news?
I don't know that I've had time to have an intellectual reaction yet. I'm still having an emotional one. That is an absolutely gruesome story that you just told me. What's the question? What's my intellectual reaction?
Yes.
What do you mean? Give me a better question. I don't know what you're asking for.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing. You know, people say sometimes to me that people who are for freedom are somewhat autistic or Asperger's-like, and they portray libertarians in general as cold and machine-like, engineering-like logicians. And To that I say that neurons, nervous system cells, don't only think, they also feel. The reactions that I have gotten from locals here in the Netherlands are to the effect that they believe that this deserves the death penalty, that they find it impossible to think that the victim, if the victim survives, will not even be grown up by the time that the aggressor is out of jail. There have been also comments to the effect that there are omissions from the press, from the official media, about the aggressor, in terms of the available articles say something to the effect of he was raised and grew up here in the Netherlands. And I don't really know what libertarian theory of law has to say about this. And it is very difficult. So I want to segue a little bit back into the interview and the upbringing, the religious upbringing. I should share with you that I was also raised in my particular case as a Roman Catholic in my home country of Costa Rica. And that I became interested in a book called the Didache, called the Wisdom or the Training of the 12 Apostles, because I was trying to look for a negative formulation of the Golden Rule, as in not active but passive, not about what you should do but what you should refrain from doing, in the history of Western civilization. It goes back to Benjamin Constant or John Stuart Mill, the idea of not harming others, the Roman law, don't harm others, Greek medicine, first thing, do not effect damage. And this idea constantly obsessed me, and so I went and I looked at this text that predates the writing of the New Testament, and what I was able to find was this: training of the Lord through the 12 apostles for the Gentiles. There are two ways, one of life and one of death, and there is a great difference between the two ways. On the one hand, the way of life is this: first, you will love God who created you. Second, you will love your neighbor as yourself. On the other hand, the way of life is this: as many things as you might wish not to happen to you, likewise do not do to another. And this particular phrasing, for those who are interested in law, legal theory, libertarian theory, is not exactly the same as love others as yourself, as the one from the canonical Gospels. So I would like to hear any comment that you have on what I just read to you.
Okay, so we're not talking about the baby situation. We're talking
No,
about
I am left speechless. I don't know even how to begin addressing non-aggression principle, criminal law. I think that the state, the political, the chambers of power, Congress, Parliament, Legislative Assembly, however you call it, the dictators of the law, of the state criminal law, the enforceable criminal punishment, did not even foresee in this country an event happening of such evil magnitude that they categorized the punishment specifically for that. So I think it escapes us all, and so yes, I would like to instead hear what you say about this idea of a way of life, a way of death. One, love God who made you; the other, love your neighbor as yourself. On the other hand, the way of life is this: as many things as you might not wish to happen to you, likewise do not do unto to another. What do you think about this idea, and how would you relate it? How would you say it overlaps as a set with libertarian non-aggression principles, etc.
Yeah, if there is a single through line from most ethical, moral theories throughout thousands of years of recorded and not recorded and verbal and storied history in the human species, it is the golden rule: do unto others and don't do unto others, which is it's reciprocal that you're talking about. And I think it's because it's basic sort of game theory. It's really basic logic. If you want the world to have less aggression, then don't add to the aggression in the world yourself. If you demand to be treated with certain respects, then you have to do that for other people too. Else, why would they be kind to you?
It was a controversial idea. I lost one subscriber. My channel is very small at this point, and the subscriber unsubscribed when I presented news in the context of a paper by Stefan Kinsella, who I personally met years ago at the Property and Freedom Society. Proportionality and punishment. And here the argument was made that something to the effect that those rights that you violate in others, you lose voluntarily. So that, for example, the murderer, after a due process and trial and cross-examination of the evidence, is proven beyond the shadow of a doubt to be guilty of homicide, he, finding himself in a jurisdiction where capital punishment is enforceable, cannot then turn to the local authorities, statist or otherwise, and say, aha, but you see, you do exactly the same as I did. That he is, to use an archaic form of English, stopped, prevented from making this argumentation because actions speak louder than words, and to the effect that he agrees with his actions with a method called involuntary deadly force imposed against another person, he cannot counter-argue. He is only avoiding the natural consequences of his actions. This caused a subscriber to unsubscribe and saying that he found this to be just a justification of murder by state. And then I presented him with cases of serial killers, for example, in the United States. And I said, well, the issue that I take here is that short of containment, which definitely would not be disproportional in light of the act of aggression, of jailing, that otherwise you release people who openly state, sometimes during trial, that they would be willing to do the same kind of actions again. And the statement that, yes, but since in this moment they are no longer imminently threatening anyone, that you cannot use force, seems somewhat unsatisfactory for justice. I am very interested in hearing what you have to say about this, because I particularly respect the logician aspect of your work. I have followed your work, I've seen your work on logical fallacies, and I really respect you as a logician. So I would like to hear your take on this.
I am not a professional logician. I just want to say that up front. Humility is always step one when having these discussions. I have studied it. I'm not completely ignorant, but I would not call myself a professional logician. Second thing, Kinsella is talking about a legal term within a legal framework called estoppel. I think a lot of followers mistake that for a moral philosophy or some kind of ethical system. He's talking about a legal concept in a legal system, which is totally fine, even in a free society, as long as people consent to it. But it's not without problems. This is not me critiquing it or saying I disagree with it. I think it's a good one to have in a legal system that I would probably agree to in a lot of circumstances. But I just wanted to mark the distinction between the legal system and legal concepts and terms and moral philosophy. The third thing is you wanted me to comment on basically what happens to someone's rights once they've aggressed on another, which is a great question and core to libertarianism. It's also what I've pretty much spent the last 7 years of my studies in libertarian moral philosophy and theory investigating. And I've pushed back on most of, not all, but most of the prominent libertarian moral philosophies. I did a tour, riding roughshod over all of the natural law theories that I could get my hands on. Lysander Spooner's, Rothbard's. There's a guy named Mark Passio that also puts forward a natural law philosophy that, well, I don't want to turn this into a natural law critique, so we'll just say that I have dealt with those. I have also examined Stefan Molyneux's universally preferable behavior. And I will continue to keep going down the list. I think another one that I'm going to be looking into soon is phenomenological conservatism, which is another way to work your way towards what are rights, who gets them, where do they come from, what sustains them, and where do they go when you do bad things. Like, these are all very important, vital questions that we have to figure out the answers to as libertarians, and I do not think that anyone has done a good enough job yet at really grounding this stuff. So that's why I've been working on it. Rather than just complaining and talking crap about everybody else, I've been trying to do my own work to build it up as well. Which is why myself and my partner or my co-author in the document, Christian, we wrote the Anti-Subjectivist Manifesto. Have you read that?
I have not read it. I should mention here that the past three now going on, no, 2 now going on 3 years of my life since I got married, moved to the Netherlands. The first was engaged mostly in the translation of a theory of natural law that leads to the same anti-statist, non-aggression conclusions by Belgian author and friend Frank van Dune. He wrote a book called The Fundamental Principle of Law that I translated over the course over the course of a year from Dutch into English. And then I was engaged in writing my own book, which I mostly dictated. So I have a friend who is a traditional socialist anarchist, who has been a friend of mine since I was 16, 39 now. And I said, would you help me write my book? I will send you WhatsApp audios and can you take dictation? And he did that. He transcribed the book, and then after I read it, I rewrote the entire book. It was in Spanish, and I rewrote it. It's not a translation, from scratch in English, and we are still working on the publication. We are self-publishing it, so the copies in print have not come out yet. I am familiar with Stefan Molyneux's universally preferable behavior. I should mention that I became an anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-libertarian in the year 2009, as influenced by universally preferable behavior by Molyneux. Then I became acquainted with Rothbard's The Ethics of Liberty, Wes Bertrand's Complete Liberty, Argumentation Ethics by Hans Hermann Hoppe. And I have not read your theory, but I should say one thing. I, from the get-go, wanted to engage actively, or become an activist, you may say, in the movement. I made a series of videos on the basic principles of freedom. Then I went on to study law in 2016 to have an understanding of the internal mechanisms of the state. Since you mentioned phenomenology, one of the things that I find interesting as a result of experience that goes back from 2009 through law school, speaking one time at a conference in London in 2013, at another Austrian economics conference in 2019 in Spain, and finding a set of challenges that led me back to Christianity, where I had to de-emphasize internal logical coherence or coherentism with what Kantian philosophers call the synthetic a priori, or Spanish philosophy calls adequationism, which is more important than the internal logical coherence of an ideology is the degree to which the concepts in a theory overlap with the functioning mechanical, physical functioning of reality, so that the insights have a practical utility. Of course, this came out of a frustration of, okay, I understand now that taxation is theft, that regulation is forcing people to do things that they don't necessarily want to do. How do we get to the next stage? How do we put this into practice in the real world? How do we get rid of taxation and regulation for people who have not committed any crime against anyone else? And that led me to my own theory, which is deeply unsatisfactory and is based on being deeply unsatisfactory. I try to rescue Western tradition, and I try to rescue the things that the postmodernists call bad about the Western tradition. So it's reductionistic, it's mechanistic, it does not try to solve it. It refers to the theory of incompleteness of Kurt Gödel and the Munchausen trilemma of justification, the idea that you end up with an infinite regress, an arbitrary starting point, or a circular logic set of tautologies. And this was all because I constantly found myself wanting to go to the legalistic route. Kinsella, who I knew personally during the time that I was studying law, he was a kind of mentor to me. After I decided to
He's a great
quit,
guy.
I completely disagree with that now, but that's informed
Oh, really?
by yes,
Okay.
but that's informed by personal history. You know, like I have. Back when I was on Facebook, I have, screenshots of Facebook conversations that I had with him. Then when I decided I'm going to quit law altogether, I'm going to move to another country and engage in peaceful activity, commercial activity, like, think of busboy, dishwasher, this kind of thing. A lot of discouragement that had been coupled with a kind of tough love encouragement that people more sensitive than myself would have really resented, to the effect of, you will become a nobody, you will become a loser, you will not be able to find a good wife, you are just throwing your career away. There is no need to become some kind of activist just because you agree with some ideas. And this is not good for your life. And also something to the effect of, by demanding that people who are academics, who are professors, who have PhDs, who have a career and are retired from that career, become some kind of martyr, or Assange, Julian Assange, John McAfee, or Roger Ver type of figure, by nagging them with long emails saying, here you have logical contradiction, or here you actually corner yourself strategically against an enemy that has rhetorical and political enforceable tools that far outweigh your social cultural influence, that when you're doing that, Sebastian, what you're doing is harassing people and you're being rude. After I received some of this tough love encouragement that other people, more sensitive people, would truthfully categorize differently. And that's actually what led me to Frank van Dune. Frank van Dune wrote a book, an essay called The Lawful and the Legal, and against libertarian legalism. And he shied away from black and white constructivist definitions of here's the line, past this line, nothing else counts. My own theory takes away morality. Morality goes back to Latin, mores, traditions, and that which is passed over from generation to generation and has a kind of interpersonal collective context. Instead, in order to be reductionistic, in order to satisfy a kind of libertarian desire to say here's a dividing line, and very influenced by Kinsella, I say that justice, or the enforceable, whose manifestation in the world of persons who have wills and can choose to act and not to act in different ways, is fundamentally the defense, the practice of the defense of the physical materiality of the real person. Not a juridical person like a corporation or a political person like a sovereign entity like the Vatican or Liberland, but real persons. And that as such, it is an ethics of force. It is not a morality to the extent that it is not concerned with right and wrong outside of anything other than force. But that force alone transcends all political, cultural, domestic contexts. And the reason being that force has potentially irreversible, physically destructive effects. Because it is not only aggressing the rights of another, but potentially destroying the physical materiality, the body of a person in a way that is irreversible, that this behooves that we draw a line in the sand. And that it is an ethic because it speaks strictly to the individual, regardless of context. It decontextualizes, it isolates the individual to mechanically determine, like a computational checklist, this good, this bad. In what context? Of force. So it doesn't matter if you're in the desert. If you're in the desert and you meet another person, this ethic informs you how you're supposed to operationally use your body. Your feet, your weapons, your hands. You may not invade or use the physical materiality, the physical bodies that the other person owns from his own body to clothing, property, possessions, without their consent. And this is, of course, basically coming to the libertarian idea of the non-aggression principle, without saying that it requires an auxiliary theory of property rights, that you also have to explain self-ownership. No. This is just a list of do's and don'ts about force, regardless of context, regardless of culture, regardless of place and time. And it aims to satisfy this libertarian desire for a clear, logical rule that, however, is not about coherentism. It's not about, look, the libertarian theory of class, the libertarian theory of property, the libertarian theory of politics and law is more internally consistent than the socialist or the statist. No. This is simply acknowledging that concepts overlap with reality. We have bodies, we have will, and in a manner similar to arrows, we are supposed to exercise self-restraint. We are supposed to not throw our arrows, our physical materiality, our arms, our weapons, our hands, onto certain directions. Everything else, because, and that's where it begins. But notice that what I'm doing is I'm coming first to the libertarian conclusions that we all know: anti-tax, anti-regulation, anti-murder, anti-theft, and saying, how can I make concepts for this without appealing to moral or theoretical? The reason that I give is, as I said, so all I'm saying here is that when I use the term physical materiality of real persons, real comes from the Latin res, which means a thing. So I'm talking about physical bodies. And when I say physical materiality, I am trying to exclude intentionally, by definition, intellectual property and copyright as influenced by Kinsella. The reason why not is basically that when you make use of another person's body without their consent, practical, like I come to kiss my wife and she leans forward and gives me a kiss, that is without me asking for permission, but a practical collaboration and coordination of actions, or express consent. Will you marry me? This kind of thing, when I either make use or just invade the physical materiality of another person, punch them, rape them, attack them, this has as a potential final consequence the irreversible physical destruction of a person. And the irreversibility makes it important. Now, I have come up with something that I call the escalation principle in my theory, which is the idea that after there was an act of aggression and the aggressor left and he was found guilty, he was caught, evidence cross-examined, etc., then yes, something like strict proportionality, and that's where I'm influenced by that estoppel article of Kinsella, as you say, in the context of legal institutions, of what is enforceable, then I believe that strict proportionality accords more with a balanced concept of justice. But when you are faced in any context, political, military, domestic, in the desert, with an incessant, willful, that is chosen, attack, and you have informed the other person to cease and desist, and the attack is physical, the logical outcomes lead to acknowledging that there are wills. He has a will, I have a will. And if one of the two wills does not stop, there is a danger of obliteration. The question is this: a theory of right and wrong regarding force has to answer, well, a woman kills a man, right or wrong? Wait a second, the chronology of events matters. What if it happens to be the case that the man was putting a knife to the woman, was trying to rape her? For a moment, she snatches the knife from the man, and then she kills him. And so the principle of escalation that I present is, when there is an imminent, incessant, willed, intentional attack, the non-attacker has the right to escalate all and use all means necessary, deadly force if needed, to repel the attack. And only in this context do I believe that the appeal to incentives of if you do not do this, I will do that, as you said, game theory, is actually not the institutionalization of manipulation. It's actually not the institutionalization of addressing human beings as creatures of reward and punishment so as to modify their behavior. That in this case, escalation belongs to the victim. So as you can see, I try to define things in a manner that satisfies the libertarian mind, like, for example, no intellectual property and copyright, but does not want to use or veers away from the idea of morality and context. I want to isolate mechanicize and reduce everything to force, because I don't want to have adjacent or auxiliary theories, like a theory of property rights that then determines what is right and wrong for in terms of force. No, I want a theory of force that says when you attack someone else, it is wrong. One thing that is very controversial, for example, is how you deal with children. At what point can you say that they can reject or consent to things? And of course, questions of abortion, questions of age of consent for sexual interaction arise. And this is why I mentioned this horrible story in the news. This is beyond consent. This is beyond the old traditional Western Roman border of puberty and approval of parents. This is beyond of anything controversial. This is something that I only see as the imposition of the intention, the will of a real physical human person's will onto someone who definitely has not consented, with the potential for irreversible physical damage. So the idea that I have, especially since I was brought back to Christianity in a lot of ways, as I said, informed by experience, was, look, it's about force. Force is dangerous. Force can lead to people getting killed or maimed. For everything else, golden rule in the Christian tradition, Orthodox, Baptist, Pentecostal, Catholic, has large bodies of literature. If you care about doing right and wrong, in many instances you will find answers if you seek them. But this particular subject of force is the non-negotiable. And so I would be curious to hear what you think about this framework that I more or less have presented, because I cannot send you a book with my theory. I would be very happy and curious to hear about your theory and how it may overlap and then part ways from what I have just expressed to you.
I don't think you can have a normative theory of force without it also being called a morality. And I don't think you can have a normative theory of force without also inheriting or including or entailing a conceptual framework of property. And I also didn't hear any grounding for any normativity for your system of force. Meaning,
yes,
why should anyone care to follow your system?
I agree with you about the fact that, for example, if you took my theory and you were a parent teaching it to a child, he can make that objection. Meaning, in the context of morality, of tradition, the mores in Latin means just customs and traditions. If intergenerationally you were communicating my book to a child that you're raising, this question may be raised. And it's very funny that Hoppe, in his theory, another person who I no longer consider a good person, but that is a more controversial thing. You'll see Walter Block and Mises Institute file for that. But in his theory, when he refers to Hume, and how Hume says, well, you cannot derive an ought from an is, what you cannot derive how things should be from how things are. Then Hoppe just very willy-nilly dismisses it by saying, but this is an objection that is unsurmountable for any other theory. It's not specifically and particularly only to my theory. And I can say that, yes, a nihilistic, a moral nihilistic skeptic, someone who does not believe in right and wrong, is always free to do that. And I can accept it, actually. In physical practice, that per se is not a violation of the non-aggression principle. I also say that indeed the normativity that I present of my theory refers to general conceptions of justice that mostly have to do with Christianity and its development on an influence on philosophy over a span of 2,000 years that have shaped how we, people of the Americas, people of Western Europe, people of Australia and New Zealand, interpret the concept of justice. So I say, if you care about goodness in the broad sense, you should know that your concept of goodness is related to Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian faith, and that will suffice to let you know that you live in a system of enforcement, the state, that is not just according to the golden rule, according to do no harm of Roman law, or first do no harm of Greek medicine. Now, the second question is more important to me because it has to do with taking that Hume presumption, the upturning. Since Aristotle, the idea was, if you want to make a theory of right and wrong, first you have to understand reality. It has to make reference to reality. It can be as logically coherent as you want, but it has to refer to operational human beings and how things are. And so, for me, this is the foundational point, that I'm telling you, this is good, this is bad. Why? Because if you do bad long enough, if you attack someone and they defend themselves, you may end up physically damaged irreversibly. You may die. Your physical destruction. Or
Maybe.
they may, but there is the possibility of irreversible physical damage. Now, the presumption is not to say something like Austrian economics of up to now you have preferred survival and physical well-being, integrity of your body, and therefore it would make sense that you would not want someone else to destroy you. I told Walter Block that I think that the historical basis of the non-aggression principle of libertarianism seems to me to be the broader golden rule of Christianity. But he said, oh, no, we can hack this very easily, because the sadomasochist, by virtue of declaring himself a sadomasochist, can just say, now it's my turn. And so what I try to do is say, look, Kurt Gödel says, no system contains its own proof, its own justification. So we're working with reality. In reality, there are people, they have bodies. Those bodies can be destroyed. Those people can choose to act and not to act invasively. And therefore, I, as a libertarian, say to you, everything that is not a violation of the non-aggression principle, as per libertarian jargon, is not per se a physical invasion of the materiality, the physical materiality of another person, whether it be their things or their biological things. Everything else you can live with.
Why should anyone care about that?
Oh, I am not. Let me put it this way: I am not speaking to the moral skeptics, to the people who say there is no morality. I am not speaking to the ethical nihilists who say.
So you are a moral realist?
I, as a Christian, as a transcendentalist, Neoplatonist, I believe in a more than physical reality of right and wrong. However, I don't try to speak to people who are neither libertarians or in the context of the Western history of concepts of law, enforceability, and justice. I say in my book that this book is for people within these coordinates, geographically, people from what you may call the Spanish-speaking world, the English-speaking world. So I am not trying to convince non-libertarians or non-Westerners or moral and ethical skeptics. I am simply trying to say, let us not complicate ourselves with having to pile up theory upon theory. We are under attack, especially after the 2 years of 2020 through 2022. There's a lot of people who use rhetorical appeals effectively to get financing for political parties, for states.
Okay,
And
so you're speaking with a moral anti-realist. So if you didn't want those critiques, then you invited the wrong guy on your show.
but I believe that
Because
you're
I
a
used to
libertarian.
be a moral realist, and then I challenged all those positions, and I arrived at where I am now.
So you believe that there is no transcendental, metaphysical, and physical right and wrong?
I have seen non-sufficient evidence of such.
But you remain a libertarian in terms of preferring, both in your individual practice, the non-destruction of your own body, and in your own practice, the non-destruction and non-attack of other people's bodies.
Do I prefer that? Yes.
Yeah, but I don't ask to you this question in terms of theory. I ask you whether have
Well,
you
you
ever
asked
been
me what I thought of your theory, so that's why I went down
yeah,
that road.
have you ever been attacked?
Yes.
Were you able to escape, or did you have to defend yourself?
I both.
Okay. And have you ever attacked someone?
As the initiatory aggressor?
Yes.
No.
In your life? Okay.
No.
So to say that Patrick Smith, in his actions, prefers not attacking other people and not being attacked by other people is a historically accurate description of the physical reality that we live in.
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you this question. Would you prefer, if it were possible, I mean, I had the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Liberland. You have also covered Liberland. Would you prefer to live in a place where, or would you prefer a modification of the political and legal institutions to the effect that you didn't have to pay taxes or follow regulations, or stay in a small scale as an agorist so that you could just do whatever you want as long as you do not attack others? If you could choose it, would you choose that?
Agorism aside, because that's a deeper topic. Yeah, I would in general prefer to be coerced less.
So in that historical context of the description of reality and of intentions, I mean, I take your word for it. I presume you innocent. That is a good thing of the Western tradition, the idea of the presumption of innocence. So I take you at your word. My book was written as a kind of reductionistic approach to, we have to corner the concepts into a hermetically sealed overlap with physical reality that allows for historical victory. I come from, my name is Ortiz. I come from Costa Rica. The only reason why my name is Ortiz and I speak Spanish is because at some point after the fall of the empire, the Roman Empire, Spain was invaded by the followers of Mohammed, and then there was a war, lasted, about 14 centuries, from the complete conquest of the Iberian Peninsula to the complete reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by Christians. And then when the Spaniards came to places like Mexico, the Indians, they had, on the rough estimate, the lowest estimate is, the highest is 150,000, but the lowest estimate is about 20,000 people per year were taken by the Aztecs to have their heart taken out and eaten, the blood. And so the local Indian tribes sided with the Spaniards and overthrew the Aztecs. So my entire history, my entire past, is based on more or less two big happenings. One is there were these pesky, annoying Christians that the Roman Empire was not able to uh, persecute into oblivion. And those that were in Spain were conquered over a period of 8 centuries, and then over a period of 7 centuries, won. And so my book is a kind of conceptual manual of refined tautologies and definitions, with an aspiration for those people who are in the West and for those people who are, like yourself, in the preference of freedom, to eventually win a intergenerational, perpetual, cultural, conceptual war against what may be perceived to be the opponent. It is not so much aimed to be the most beautiful in terms of logical coherence theory, but the most reductionistic, simple, communicable, and operational in the physical world of if I send sound waves to you that are intelligible to you, and they can rhetorically convince you, then I have been effective.
All right. Was there something else you wanted to talk about, or?
Yes, I want to ask you about this idea, because I believe you have children.
I do.
What do you think of approaching the entire theoretical knowledge of what we know about reality and liberty and anti-liberty statism, aggression, institutionalized or otherwise, as in the framework of a permanent, until victory, intergenerational crusade to abolish a system that is considered incompatible with our way of living, like slavery was in its day? What do you think of this approach that I've taken in my book? Of it's all about winning, and it's all about them not being able to enforce on us.
Well, I haven't read your book, so just going off what you said in the last 50 minutes, or even just off what you just said right now, like, yeah, it's definitely an intergenerational activist social change effort, much like the abolition of slavery, much like the abolition of baby murder, abortion, much like the abolition of Aztec, heart carving out and throwing people down the steps of their pyramids. Um, it's a continuing, infinite war for treating people better, and we're the current warriors.
But you don't believe it's a war spiritually, or do you?
I see no evidence for anything spiritual.
So, so for you, this would be to the effect that we're not in a field actually fighting, like in that novel Alongside Night. Um, it's a conceptual war of ideas.
Yeah, I thought you were speaking conceptually or allegorically. I don't think I have a soul floating out there in the street fighting my neighbor's soul who is anti-gun. I think, yeah.
Well, I want to ask you something about this. I have crafted my own heresy, and
Okay.
I call it Solo Logos, or Only by Jesus. And I was having this conversation about like agnostics, atheists, and Jews, and do I wish them as a believer? Do I wish them their destruction? And I was like, no, no, no. I am supposed to want to love them as much as I love myself. So, because of the concept of Pascal's wager, the idea of it's probably better to live your life as though there was a God and then there wasn't, than the logical opposite, to live your life like there wasn't a God and then there turns out to be. Just probabilistically, I think that the authenticity, what makes a person's belief genuine, is actually their selfish, fallen human nature of wanting to save themselves. If I, by asking Jesus Christ, accepting him as the Messiah of the Jews and his teaching in the Golden Rule and practicing the Golden Rule, I can acquire opportunistically, selfishly, can use him as the mechanism of my infinite life extension, then yes, by all means. But I also wish it for someone else. I don't wish them to be annihilated. Like there are some branches of Christianity that believe that actually some souls, the ones that are not resurrected after the second coming, that those persons just kind of disappear from the record, like that there's no heaven or hell for them. No, I don't wish that. I lovingly, as much as I love myself, I wish that even for my atheist and agnostic neighbors. So I said, Jesus alone is good enough. Because for Christians to say, Jesus of Nazareth, the historical person, is my God, I worship this individual physical person who existed as my God, is not an act of blasphemy. And as agnostic atheist Christian, it is true that the Pascal wagers in terms of probabilistic odds is not a bad choice. I mean, it comes at the opportunity cost of not being so proud to say I'm above belief. But even if you were, I am happy to say that every bit as much, if there's an eternal life, a resurrection of the body, I wish it for you. But the question that I would like to ask you is, first, if it were possible to indefinitely live in the flesh, it's not the resurrection of the soul, it's the resurrection of the flesh. If it were possible to live indefinitely and continue to have a conscious experience of reality, would you choose it? Because there are people who, for example, choose euthanasia, like the late Thomas Schasch, great libertarian. And the second question is, just based on your most recent comment, that would mean that your conscious awareness and perception of reality, according to your view, is fully dependent on the continued existence of your physical body.
Yes, I would like to continue living for, I won't say indefinitely, but for as long as I want. Who knows? Who knows what might happen 3 billion years in the future? I might not find that a good thing. But as to Pascal's wager, premise one of Pascal's wager is unfounded. So premise one is the Christian God is the God in play, not the Islamic God, not the Gnostic demiurge, which is more of, could be like a trickster, not an evil God in which I would, if I wanted to ingratiate myself to that Pascal's wager, I might want to be a little evil now and then to make him like me more, and not being a little evil every now and again is or being evil, a little bit evil every now and again, is totally worth eternal life. So I'll take. Should I take that Pascal's wager? There's no founding for any of these initial God premises. So
I agree with you that the Pascal's wager seems to be predicated on a loving Creator, saving God, as per the Christian God. I can agree with that, and that the logical consequences that then follow from that, as you say, are more about internal coherence of logical statements than anything that we can physically verify by our own means in reality. But what about the second question? Does that mean that you think that your mind, the concept of your mind, is completely and fully dependent on the continued existence of the physical materiality of your person?
I believe mind and consciousness is a emergent property of deterministic matter, and that's, when I say believe, that is my current understanding and belief. I'm not saying I know that. I'm easily persuaded with evidence to the contrary. That's just my current understanding.
So you're not close to new knowledge, to the opposite.
I'm sorry, what?
You're not close to new knowledge.
I try not to be close to any new knowledge. I want to know as many true things as I can and as few false things as I can.
But
a
you do
motto
have
of
the
mine.
but you do have the conviction that your mind is a consequence of your body.
I believe the experience of mind is um, an emergent property of physical reality.
Are you what is called a determinist, or do you believe that the contemplation of possible avenues of action entails the ability of choice or free will?
So I'm if we're talking physics, I would call myself a super determinist. If we're talking free will, I would call myself a determinist.
So, how do you, what is your conviction or belief regarding the experience that you have of, as I say, to use the arrow analogy, of you choosing not to attack someone who has just attacked you, but instead running away because you think it's a better chance of not provoking further harm either on yourself or the other person. How do you experience that choice within the framework of the determinism that you just mentioned?
I'm not sure what the question is. I experience choice exactly like you, man.
Yes, but without a purely mimetic common ground. What I mean is, how does choice, how choosing, for example, to run away instead of defending yourself all the way into deadly consequences, how do you, what is the link between being a deterministic thinker philosophically and your own experience of choice and free will? How do these come together?
So I think if anyone makes a decision and then attempts to introspect on exactly the mechanics of how that choice was made, they'll find that they do not have sense data for that information. What we do have is a super powerful rationalization machine, which will come up with post facto explanations for why we chose that. But no one actually has the experience of the mechanics in the mind or in the brain of how choice is made. Because what happens, and there's some cool studies you can look at for this, is that something in the brain, subconscious, makes the decision, and then 40 to 70 milliseconds later, that choice that was made bubbles up to the consciousness, filtered through an area of the brain that rationalizes it for us when we ask why we chose that. So my answer is that neither of us know how choices are made. It's something that happens pre-conscious or subconsciously.
About this, I remember reading Mises one time where he said something to the effect of, unless you have the algorithm that gives you the predictive power of the actions of any given individual, free will, so called, remains a necessary illusion, even if just semantically. Is this more or less what you're saying?
Um, I don't know. Tell me more. Ask me that another way.
Meaning, when you imagine getting vanilla ice cream, but you pay and get the chocolate ice cream, that because you did not experience both timelines where both experiences were happening, but only chose and then reflected in hindsight on having chosen chocolate ice cream for some mysterious causal reason, that this choosing, since an external observer cannot say, and now based on this atomic or molecular data, I can say that he right now at this time is going to choose chocolate, not vanilla ice cream, that because the algorithm is not given predictively, that therefore free will or the choice range remains as a kind of necessary conceptual construct.
I'm saying that we don't know how the choices are made in our brain, but we know that they're made before we're conscious of having made a choice. That's what I said. That's what I meant. So, like, if we're standing there in front of chocolate and vanilla ice cream and we're deciding between the two, consciously, the experience is very much we look at the two, we think about the two, the concepts of the two, and then an answer is, bubbles up in our consciousness, and we're like, I choose that one, whichever one that bubbled up to us. And they can look at your brain as that's happening and see the choice being made before you consciously make the choice. So they can tell what you're going to choose before you consciously know what you're going to choose.
Do you believe there is an
I find that
influence?
fascinating.
Do you believe there is an influence that you, as a parent, for example, can have in terms of the information that is causally effective in the choices of your children? For example, teaching them the principles of liberty and so on. Because
Yes.
my question about this would be, what are your thoughts on self-restraint when you feel like punching someone, but you actually hold back? How would you address this?
Yeah. So a part of our brain is responsible for that restraint. The frontal neocortex, I believe, is what is the part that's responsible for that, and it's the part that's underdeveloped in children, which is why they have a lot of problems self-regulating emotions. When they feel a certain way, they can't help themselves but act on it because they have underdeveloped frontal lobes, and part of parenting is to help them through those times until they've developed farther and become an adult, which to varying degrees at one time or another, we can also control our emotions. Some humans not so much.
So you think that this aspect that is not moral realism, but the communicated preference for not attacking others and not being attacked by others, is something that can be learned and taught.
So was the question, do I think non-aggression can be taught to children?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that it can effectively be learned and taught.
Absolutely.
Controlling for the outliers, the martyrs that will go through all means necessary, like Julian Assange, and the psychopaths who will keep on aggressing even if they're put in jail and so on. Do you think that the information of the communication of these concepts is able to surmount those outliers? Basically what I'm saying is, do you think that the ideas are powerful enough that they can make it so that nurture trumps nature?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think we have evidence of modern society being less aggressive and violent all around us, and that comes from nurture. Um, I think I just saw a very interesting paper on this. It was it was examining the question of how much more intelligent have humans become in the past 100,000 years of evolution, and the answer is we're just about as smart as we used to be 100,000 years ago. Um, Most advancements really kicked off when language became a thing, when somebody figured out language and taught each other language, and then over hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of years, being able to start passing down our ideas instead of having them lose when we die. This is all nurture. This is all teaching each other from birth about ideas and culture and society and how to live better.
You reminded me of one of my favorite books of the Jewish scriptures, the Kohelet, that is the Ecclesiastes. Um, it's said to be the most liked by atheists book of the Bible. Are you familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes?
Uh, in passing, it's been a long time since I've read the Bible.
There it says, there's nothing new under the sun, and of course there's the Gospel of John of in the beginning was the Word, and the importance of verbal abstract thinking. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about literature, if you don't mind. Are you familiar with this book Dune by Frank Herbert?
I love the series. Yeah.
What can you tell me about it? What is your opinion? How you came into contact with it, and yeah, your basically your review of Dune the novel, how you remember it when you read it, etc.
I read it because I've always been a fan of sci-fi and fantasy stories. So I was into it before I was an anarchist, but much like I read, there's a book series called the Sword of Truth series by a guy named Terry Goodkind, who I was a wild fan of when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, long before I even really thought about anything political or moral or philosophical. And there's a book in that series called Faith of the Fallen, and it's the seventh book in the series, and you're in the middle of basically the main character has traveled to another nation in another part of the world that's totally foreign to him, and he experiences an entire society run um, under communism. The book never says the word communism, never says any sort of normal modern name for communism. He just tells the story. And I had no idea it was communism when I was reading the book. And later in life, I look back on it and I see what the author was doing. He was teaching me about the the violence and despair and destruction of life and property that is communism without ever saying it. Dune, I think, has another very vital lesson in it that has to do with deifying and giving power to man over others. And it was a very interesting way to tell the story over what was the series spans like 70,000 years, and the Dune book specifically only covers a small fraction of the story, but it is a truly epic tale of a guy that fell into godlike powers and decided to use those godlike powers to try to teach the human species, not even just like the current living ones, but intergenerationally install knowledge into the human species about what happens when you believe in gods and kings and giving power over other people, and the harm and horror that can fall out of it. And he decided to teach that to the human species by doing it to them. It was wild. It was wild. And like if people that have been watching the recent movie series will be like, what the hell is he talking about? Because that overarching tale to the series is not really contained much in the one book, but you have to get the whole series to see that.
It seems to me that this refers a lot to the idea of those universal commonalities of humanities, and the constant potential that never goes away for asking for a king, asking for a political or military savior to come and solve every problem for you in the here and now, instead of, as Jesus of Nazareth would say, just reflecting on the nature of goodness for your own sake, not seeing the eye of the other. What I found interesting about the Dune book is that focus on human psychology as a high level of distrust. Economists talk about high trust society. One thing that I noticed about Dune, which was very much revolving around a desert and a commodity that was highly prized throughout the universe, was that it was a high distrust society, and everybody was presuming that everyone else is just trying to defraud them or scam them for profit. And in the midst of all this, there's the protagonist, Paul Atreides. I want to ask you, by the way of psychology, what are your thoughts on Jordan Peterson?
There are three different Jordan Petersons depending on the subject that he's talking about. When he's talking about psychology, I think he is wicked smart. I think he's a savant that is doing some good work. And I enjoy hearing his thoughts on various psychological phenomenon and how people interact and how to analyze and understand people's personalities. I took his personality test, and I thought it was fantastic. And when I have other people take it, and when they show me the results, I find that its insights are pretty good. Jordan Peterson, the theist, I find I'm going to use I'm going to use hyperbolic words just because it makes the communication clear, but I don't mean it nastily. I find him disingenuous and hypocritical. He spent years talking about God. Turns out he is. Turns out years later we find out that he's basically um, an agnostic, and he's just redefined the word God to mean whatever's at the top of your value hierarchy. Which is, I mean, it's fine to talk about that. It's fine to have that discussion. But he spent years without ever. If you're going to change the definitions of words that you're using when talking to people, that's fine. We all have to do that, especially in philosophy. Sometimes there is no word for what we're talking about, so we have to make up one or reuse one that has a different definition. But you have to clarify it up front. You have to say, hey guys, when I'm talking about God, I'm not talking about, necessarily Jesus Christ of the Bible. I'm talking about whatever's at the top of your value hierarchy. It's like, oh, okay, now we can have that conversation on fair terms. But for years, he talked about that subject without making that distinction. And that gained him a massive following of faith-based people that I don't know that he deserved. And I think he did it in an intellectually dishonest way.
And the
So
third,
in that area, I don't like him much. I don't find that good behavior.
Jordan Peterson.
Um, I This is the activist Jordan Peterson, the one that fearlessly defends what he sees to be true in spite of against the whole world, and that is that's role model stuff. Like sacrifice potentially your entire career, sacrifice into potentially your entire income. He didn't know he was going to lose his job at that college over Bill C-16 years and years ago, and fall into multi-million-dollar contracts on shows on Daily Wire. Like he had no idea any of that was in the future. He was just doing what he thought was right. He was not going to allow himself to be told what to say to keep a job. That's heroic. That's
I,
aspirational for me.
I am reminded of a song by American rock and roll band Tool that is called Hush, that says, I can't say what I want to, even when I'm not serious. I can't say what I want to, even when I'm just kidding. But I would like to defend my God and sacrifice myself in saying that I am very grateful to Augustine of Hippo, the theologian, about the doctrine of original sin and the fallen nature of man, something to the effect that man tends towards error, and when he gains knowledge, he uses it for his own selfish profit, sometimes and a lot of times to the expense of others. And I say this because of a position of advantage. The physical person who existed, that I worship as a God, Jesus of Nazareth, said, I am the truth, the life, and the way. And that, in many ways, and the book of the Gospel of John helps me cope emotionally with the struggle, the struggle, as you mentioned, of not just redefining God to whatever is suitable for my financial purposes of giving lectures and selling books to Christians also. But going back to your third, Jordan Peterson, I have to say this is something that I do think is respectable. I decided that if I became a lawyer, my uncle was a famous jurist in Costa Rica. At the bar, there's a painting with his name and an amphitheater named after him, or a judge or something like that, that this would have an effect that, to my mind, would feel as the kind of corruption that I don't prefer. this is perhaps something that I didn't like about the characters of Dune. A lot of them were corrupt in the way that I mean.
Mm.
And, you know, I grew up wanting to have a musical rock band, a musical project. I called it Oaken too. And I didn't object so much to the moral corruption of the rock and roll rock stars as much as I would somehow to politicians, but without meaning to say in defense of Jordan Peterson, but only describing myself, I can say that most of the time my imperfect desire, preference, aspiration, hope for a God is selfish, is for the sake of the mechanism of my own salvation, or also insincere. That is, as a rhetorical common ground, conceptual common ground, to convince people of freedom. Of freedom in the libertarian sense, non-aggression. But that leads me back to the idea of libertarian theory. I would like you to please give me a summary, because I have seen your work. I see you interviewing the anarcho-capitalists in ANARCHAST, but I am curious in you, of being the one who asks the guy from ANARCHAST, can you tell me your theory of freedom in a nutshell, as informed by experience and your own research?
So we wrote a manifesto called the Anti-Subjectivist Manifesto. For people that want the long version, antisubjectivism.com. And by long version, it's only 10 pages long. It's not going to require a month of your life to study. It's pretty straightforward. A more full book on the practicalities of it needs to happen, but we wanted to get the manifesto out there first. So the manifesto begins with sort of acknowledging certain premises that things like what are truth, the laws of logic, and sort of the metaphysical reality, which is a contradiction in terms a little bit. Understanding the reality of the state of nature, coming to terms with the state of nature as several people have used the term throughout the years in philosophy, and then really refining on that as a starting point for how we build up to ethics. We also tried to. It's difficult to give the full summary and make it coherent and follow a single path, but it also forms a meta-ethical evaluation framework for all moral philosophies, because it highlights how most of them are almost completely devoid of any connection to reality that isn't presumed or taken as some sort of brute fact. It really attempts to build up from the actual state of nature, which is an amoral existence. A lion kills a gazelle. There's no moral particle to be found in the air after the lion kills the gazelle that we can walk up to with a detector and see good or evil particles. And the same goes for when a human murders another human or kills another human. Murder presumes unjustified killing. So when one human kills another human, there aren't good or evil particles floating in the air that are detectable in reality to give us a deterministic, material, moral judgment. So it lays all this out. It spends the first half of it is laying out these as the starting point, and this has to be the starting point from which any moral philosophy begins, because if they don't deal with or begin with reality, then it's sort of like they're telling a fairy tale. They're telling a story of a submarine with no mention of water. So the first half of it is just talking about reality. The second half then attempts to build up to consent and property rights with as little to none subjectivity as possible. So the downfall of almost every moral philosophy in existence is arbitrariness and subjectivity. Arbitrariness meaning, for example, would be something like Rawlsianism. A better example would just be, let's just go with like utilitarianism, right? So certain things are arbitrarily defined as good and others are bad. Utils are arbitrarily deemed as the good, and the more utils we have, the more gooder that you are. And that's a gross simplification, but you get it. So there are arbitrary selections, and things that are arbitrary are necessarily unfounded. And the existence of unfounded premises in your argument are flaws to be surmounted, not normal course of reasoning. And I think you'll find in most moral philosophies, they sort of just insert these things into their philosophies. Just, I don't know. Either they don't see it or they just hope you won't. But there's a lot of subjectivity. There's a lot of arbitrariness in most moral philosophies. So we start out by calling that out and saying our job as thinking, reasoning people is to build to our conclusions with valid and sound arguments, with no arbitrariness or subjectivity. And so we work our way to the fact that rights are not. It's a non-realist position. Rights don't exist. Rights are mutual, reciprocal agreements between people that choose to continue doing so. And the moment someone stops reciprocating rights with you is the moment you have no onus to continue reciprocating rights with them. An example of, that's just a really complicated way of saying, if I punch you, you can now punch me. Why? Well, I stopped reciprocating your right to not be punched. So why would you continue reciprocating my right to not be punched? Like, that would just be pathological altruism. And so that's kind of where we build up to. It's called anti-subjectivism, not objectivism, because number one, objectivism is already taken by a philosophy that poorly attempts to jump Hume's dichotomy.
I want to ask you about the first part. Since good and evil.
Well, let me just say one final thing. So it's called anti-subjectivism because a lot of people misunderstand this, and maybe it's our fault for picking a bad name. But it's called anti-subjectivism because it's against subjectivism. It's anti-subjectivism. The goal is as little to no subjectivity and arbitrariness as possible.
Is this to the effect of subjectivism as arbitrariness in matters of justice?
In matters of everything. So we attempt to use as little to no subjectivity or arbitrariness as possible to arrive at consent and property rights.
But when you say subjectivity, you mean something to the effect of whimsicality, like
subjective in philosophy typically means mind dependent.
Whereas
so objective would be mind independent.
So when you say anti-subjective, it is not in any sense a critique of the subjective theory of value of economics, but a critique of whimsicality or the logical fallacy of begging the principle, just assuming it.
It is against subjectivity. It is not anti-subjectivism. Like, it's not against an existing philosophy called subjectivism. It is against subjectivity, which is found in all moral philosophies. Not all, but most moral philosophies.
And the question that I wanted to ask you about the first point, since in your book you mentioned that good and evil are not reducible to physical properties, like here's the evil atom or the evil tissue, and you mentioned the word metaphysics, would you say that good and evil relate to reality in a non-physical way that can only be established intersubjectively by communicating, language dependent? What is the position in the book?
In what book?
I'm sorry, in your writing. So let me restate the question.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned that good and evil are not reducible to physical particles or elements, like the atom of goodness and the atom of evil,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned the word metaphysics,
Mm-hmm.
would you say that good and evil as a conceptual construct are based on an intersubjective, communicable understanding of the term? What is the position taking in your writing? Or what do you mean by metaphysic?
I mean, I meant the document contains a metaphysical critique of many other moral philosophies that contain subjectivity, or that smuggle in an is-ought violation, or that do other, or that start from starting points that are not the ocean the submarine's in. They start with some downstream subjective or intersubjective notion like culture or society, and doing that without justification or grounding is just sort of nonsense. You're just writing fairy tales of how you want the world to act because you hope it feels nice to people.
This, by the way, is very funny because the way you just described it is the intention behind my book or the sentiment. But the thing that I would like to refer to of what you said is the rights. It's curious that in my book, I don't use the word rights. I talk about force, bodies, and the enforceable as physical possibilities of reality. Because rights, I think, in most theories, suffer of the kind of subjectivity and arbitrariness that you're mentioning.
It also leaves people in danger, because when you reify rights into something that exists, you feel protected by them. And when people use language, when they use realist language for rights, they say things like, "I have rights. He took my right to what away. He sacrificed his rights by attacking someone else," or "I have rights. I am protected by rights. You must respect my rights that exist." This is all nonsense that leaves people feeling more protected than they are. And when the Constitution of the United States says, everyone has inherent rights given to them by their humanity or God, like, this is nonsense. There's nothing there. The only way rights exist are pragmatically in the interactions between people that consent to behave better towards one another.
I
And
think that
people have to actively choose to do so. And the moment they stop choosing to do so, there's no rights shield that appears and protects you from other people attacking you or punching you or harming you.
you mentioned at the beginning of the interview the name Lysander Spooner and how he says the Constitution is either causally to blame or
Be
it
it
did
one thing
nothing
or another.
or it did nothing to prevent your so-called rights from being violated. But here I agree 100% with
The
what you said.
Constitution has either authorized a government such as we have had or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist.
And that connects to that dangerous illusion that you're just mentioning right now.
Yeah.
Like the very horrible case that we talked about, this horrible news at the beginning. It seems wholly and solely dependent on, as you say, not a concept of rights as if it magically disprevents evil, destructive actions, but as you say, people choosing, making choices of how to interact with others.
Yeah, so we mark a distinction in the manifesto. What we coin a term. We call them state of nature beings. State of nature beings. And that's a dehumanizing term. And my emotional reaction to that is that I don't like it when we dehumanize people. But that is exactly what happens when someone does that to their child. They have already taken the human out of that situation. They do not deserve to be thought of, treated like, or dealt with on the level of other humans. They have reduced themselves to the state of nature existence. The state of nature just being one of tooth and fang and might makes right and power. And what can one do, not what one ought do. What one ought do is up here with us humans. And I don't mean to make it about species, and I'm not referencing veganism or anything like that. All I mean is there are state of nature beings, lions, tigers, bears, baby rapists, let's say, and then there's the people that have managed to elevate themselves out of the state of nature by reciprocating rights with other people of like mind. And,
Yes, I
that's
agree.
the distinction.
I agree 100% with you, and I think that I thank you, because I think this perhaps was what I meant when I asked you at the beginning, and as you said, you needed time to process it in your analysis of the situation. Obviously, I think that there's a limit to the psychology of instrumentalizing others. Obviously, you can cooperate, collaborate, and coordinate your actions in interacting with others to exchange, to trade, to engage in commerce. But the moment that you, as you say, dehumanize the other person and see their being, their physical being, as a mere tool for the satisfaction of your own goals, I think that it strikes me as the beginning of evil. What do you think?
Evil as colloquial defined, sure, absolutely. So every time we take an action, we justify that action by something, tacitly, subconsciously. It doesn't require conscious effort. We don't have to sign a form that says, I hereby justify this next breath I'm taking by the following, XYZ justification. But even tacitly, when we take an action, we're justifying it by something. I have the right to because it's my property, is one justification. I have the power to because I'm bigger and my fangs are sharper and I'm stronger. It will bring more happiness. It will bring more net happiness to the world if I remove all of your organs and save the life of 7 people dying and in need of organ transplants. Because 7 people will get to live for the cost of 1 dying. So we end up with a net positive of happiness in the world with this action. That's another justification. That's like a consequentialist's justification. And what we attempted to do in the manifesto was analyze all of the justifications, which are just moral philosophies. These are all moral equations that we use to evaluate the interactions between people. And we find that 95, 99% of the justifications that have ever been put out there to do things are based on subjectivity or arbitrariness. And then there's 2 left at the end. When we get rid of all the chaff of subjectivity and arbitrariness, there's 2 left. One is power, might makes right. That's the state of nature. That's the default existence for everything ever in the universe. And then there's a group of people that have decided that have the capacity to comprehend consent and property, and that choose to reciprocate respect for those things between themselves. It is an ongoing requirement. It's something that we have to do constantly. If we don't want to be if we don't want to be subjected to the terrors of tooth and fang in the state of nature, we have to participate actively with people to respect their consent and property. Even the notions of consent and property, and this is the big point in the manifesto, the idea, the concepts, consent and property, are the antithesis of the state of nature. Those two, to the extent consent and property exists, is inversely proportionate to the extent that power and might makes right and the state of nature exists. One of those 2 things reduces the other, or those 2 things reduce each other when they're introduced.
I want to say that I am very happy that you brought this up, because I think that that you have explained this to me, because I can see how you think and how I think very largely overlaps. I remember the first series of YouTube videos that I had made in the year 2011 about principles of freedom, and I presented a critique of majoritarian rule. And by the way of organs, I said, imagine if 6 drunkards who need a liver transplant, they vote by majority rule to take out a compatible donor's liver and raffle it amongst themselves. And it also connects a little bit to my own view of the dangers of irreversible physical damage. But I'm also reminded of the late American comedian George Carlin, and I say this, by the way, in praise of your theory as you have presented it to me and the audience, that he used to say, I believe that I have the right to do anything I want, but if you don't like it, I think you have the right to shoot me. And how do you like that? So I think that what you present in your writing is a much better deal. Having said that, I ask you, beyond the is ought, I call it fallacy, but objection, let's call it.
Okay, I'll pretend you didn't say that.
Continue. Beyond the is ought dichotomy, those alternatives. And by the way, I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place, but the neurons have fired up by the many things that you have said, and one of the things that definitely is brought back to mind is also the origin of the meaning of the state. Il Stato, Baudin, Jean Baudin, and Machiavelli, the state of political affairs. And it seems to me that in your dichotomy of might makes right and or the state of nature, it seems that actually the political institution of the nation state, with its constitutions and 3 branches of power and the oligarchy of political representatives, so-called, that it actually is the institutionalization of the state of nature, of might makes right. But I want to ask you this question. Beyond the is-ought dichotomy, is there truth in what you present?
I don't know.
Namely,
I don't understand the question. What do you mean?
to the extent that the concepts in your work and your theory overlap with reality, physical reality, going beyond the is and not dichotomy, and in light of those 2 alternatives that you mentioned at the end of your treatise, is there something that you believe is true, that can be called truth in what you try to communicate there?
Okay, so I think you're asking me how we bridge the is-ought dichotomy, how we bridge that divide. We do not attempt to, and I have not seen anyone successfully do so. I do not hold that it cannot be done. I'm sort of agnostic on the topic. I just haven't seen anybody do it yet. When they do, that will be an earth-shattering philosophical discovery. Just haven't seen it yet. It'd be really cool if somebody could. That would be the holy grail of philosophy if they could, as Molyneux once said UPB was. Patrick, did that answer your question, or are you asking me or what I consider, what my definition of truth is?
Well, since you go further and asking me to ask you, I would like to say, what about at the subjective level, in terms of your beliefs and convictions, and this may even be an expression of satisfaction.
I don't know what you mean. What are you asking?
Like, if it's not bridging the is and not dichotomy and how you did it, in terms of purely subjective satisfaction with the work produced, would you say that you have a conviction or a belief that what you wrote down contains things that are true or truth?
much of what we wrote down is what I consider to be truth. The the choice to elevate oneself above the state of nature is a choice, and there are positive and negative impetuses or reasons to make that choice that one has to make based on their value judgment. One of the main utilities that come out of it is the realization of how fragile liberty actually is. The true state of your ability to be safe from harm is actually just solely dependent on the relationships that you can build with the people around you. And the moment someone makes a choice to not respect those, you are in danger. The positive side of that coin is, look how peaceful a normal average person's life is day to day. Look how amazing the relationships that you build with friends and family and loved ones actually is at providing you rights. and when I say rights, I mean reciprocal agreements that protect you, your body, and your stuff. It works really well when you have it, and so that's important. But yeah, it comes down to a choice. We're not saying it is true that once you make this choice, there's some kind of physicality to rights or anything like that. It's just describing what rights are and how they actually function in the world.
I want to close, but before closing, I want to bring your attention to Roger Ver
Mhm.
in Mallorca, Spain. It has been the ultimate final outcome on his being handed over to the state of the United States has been postponed until May, and I can say I very deeply empathize, as I am myself awaiting for a judge to review the appeal on my residence application to be able to live and work in this country with my wife and stepson. And so
It's interesting. I have friends that are trying to escape the Netherlands, and you're fighting to stay there. It's an interesting world that we live in.
I should tell you an anecdote from the Wuhan wars of the Covidistas, when the fashionable lethal injections seemed to be everywhere. The person who is now my wife and stepson, they were trying to come visit me and be in my house with my mother in Costa Rica. And so flights were booked for them to fly, and the arrangements were made, and they drove to the airport, and at the airport, the airline did not let them, this was during, of course, the Biden administration, did not let them get on the airplane because 6 days before the flight, the transit through the United States rules arbitrarily changed for people who were not carrying the fashionable documents, like
Mm-hmm.
like the Star of David or other papieren in the
Mm-hmm.
1930s and 1940s. And so I have a good friend, Tuan Manders, tax lawyer.
You know
Who,
Tuan. I've spoken with
yes,
him before.
yeah,
Yeah.
we interviewed him in No Hay Almuerzo Gratis in the podcast with Marcel in Argentina. And indeed, it seems that if you are from the Netherlands, you're trying to escape, and they themselves tried to, and at the time were not let because of outstanding rules and regulations. Of course, this was the Wuhan wars against the people's freedom of
I
the
haven't talked to Tuan
Covidistas.
in like a decade. I need to check in with him and see how he's doing.
And so, and here I am, this is a different country. Most of the cultural background is very, very strange. The name of that work of fiction that you mentioned, can you repeat it? The one of the man who moves to relatively
It's
more
called the
status
Sword of
society.
Truth series. Sword of Truth. It's by Terry Goodkind.
And what is the book specifically of the foreigner moving to the more status society?
It's called Faith of the Fallen. It's the 7th book in the series. I would not recommend reading it first. You kind of need to read the story up till then for it to make any sense. Terry Goodkind, the author who passed away like 2 years ago, I found out later in life, after I had become an anarcho-capitalist, that he was an objectivist, a very outspoken, a Randian objectivist, and suddenly the whole book series made a lot of sense. It's very anti-collectivist, and it was just if you like fantasy novels, magic and wizards and monsters and stuff like that, it is absolutely one of the best series of all time. Would definitely recommend. It's called the Sword of Truth series.
I can say that I empathize a lot with this feeling, in a way that is true to me. I am in this country because of a mission of love, with my wife and stepson. And to the extent that I am compliant with, all the rules of the documentation and getting a lawyer and opening a procedure, it's in spite of the state of the Netherlands and because of my wife that I want to be here. But yes, as you mentioned, many people from the Netherlands trying to leave. Twan Manders moved to Florida. And
he's in Florida now. Oh, yeah. Man, I really need to connect with him then. That's awesome.
And I wanted to ask you, speaking of empathizing, yeah, I empathize with Roger Ver and his situation, the uncertainty. I know that you have a big audience, Patrick Smith, DISENTHRALL. So if you could just touch on the topic of Roger Ver before we close, I would really appreciate it.
So my main channel is ANARCHAST. DISENTHRALL is my old channel. I don't publish there anymore. I think I interviewed Roger. It may have been the last interview he did before he was arrested. We talked about his new book at the time. And then I interviewed another guy, and my mind is going blank because I'm terrible with names, right after he was arrested, who's still working on the efforts to free him. So I'm very familiar with Roger. I've spoken to him several times on all of my YouTube channels at this point, and what's happening to him is, of course, a disgusting tragedy. It's an embarrassment. It's yet another illustration in a long line of illustrations about how the justice system is pretty much anything but.
For those unfamiliar with the situation, could you broadly describe it before we get off the air?
Yeah. So the guy invests early in Bitcoin, builds a large bankroll, leaves the United States, renounces his U.S. citizenship. A decade goes by, Bitcoin continues to explode in price, and then the IRS, being the greedy, disgusting, sycophantic cartel creatures, vile beasts that they are, decide to, a decade later after he renounces his citizenship, to come after his wallet and claiming that he didn't pay enough in taxes. And so they had him arrested in a foreign country, and now they're trying to extradite him. Last I checked. I don't know what the current news is.
Patrick, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your words. Thank you very much for your answers. And I ask you to send me a message with the relevant links to your channels and websites and writings. And I am very satisfied and happy with this episode of No Free Dinner Either. Thank you.
Thank you.